Welcome back to Global Media Network, LLC. Our motto is, and always will be, educate, enlighten, entertain. PWR Network, Passion World Talk Radio, is a wholly owned subsidiary of GMN, LLC. And today our program is Lest We Forget, historical, and we're still talking about human trafficking. And Lisa Skinner will start us off with what she has found to add to the already numerous material she has previously found, followed by who's talking mainly about the U.S. and the multi-billion-dollar business of human trafficking. And then last but not least, Betsy Wurzel will sum up Lisa's and mine presentation and make some comments. The call to action is, I want you to tell me if you've ever been approached by a trafficker or you've ever had any type of experience. I would like you to tell us how you feel if your son or your daughter or even your teen son or your teen daughter or a niece or a nephew has ever been approached. And to help you out, I contacted the educational department of the US of A that gives you a list of what you should look out for your children who are at school. So take it away, Lisa.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Lest We Forget, historical. So we started off our new series last week, and I brought and bring to you the history of slavery in the U.S. And so I'm going to pick up where I left off last week and continue on that topic. The slave rebellions that plantation and slave owners feared were not a false fear. There were several rebellions after 1776 that are worth mentioning, including Gabriel's Conspiracy, which took place in the year 1800, the LGBO landing slave escape in 1803, the Chatham Manor Rebellion in 1805, the 1811 German Coast Uprising in 1811, George Boxley Rebellion in 1815, the Denmark Vesey's Conspiracy in 1822. You might have heard this one, Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion in 1831, the Black Seminole Slave Rebellion, that was with the Native Americans, from 1835 to 1838, the Armistead seizure in 1839, the Creole case in 1841, and the 1842 slave revolt in the Cherokee Nation, another one of the Native American slave revolts. And what I shared with you last week, and it was a surprise and news to me after doing my thorough research, is that slavery of the Native Americans was rampant. It wasn't only the African Americans that were shipped over here from Africa. And it turns out that they really did try to fight for their rights and revolt, but we all know through history how that turned out for them. Of those, perhaps the most famous, which I mentioned that you may have heard of, is Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion, also known as the Southampton Insurrection, where Nat Turner, an educated slave who claimed to have divine visions, organized a group of slaves and then murdered 60 white people in Southampton, Virginia. The lasting effects of this rebellion were tragic. The North Carolina militia retaliated by killing some 100 slaves, not just those suspected, but free people of color, and they lost their vote. Other slave states began to severely restrict the movements of both slaves and free people of color as a result of this. Among those laws included anti-literacy rules, which levied strong penalties on anyone who was suspected of educating slaves. So now we know what that was born out of, the fact that slaves were not allowed to learn to read or be taught to read or write. Led by free blacks such as Frederick Douglass, a free black man, and white abolitionists like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which really had a lot to do with the onset of the Civil War. Their activism grew between 1830 and 1860. Not only were abolitionists actively petitioning in the North, but they were also moving to help fugitive slaves escape from the South through a collection of what they called safe houses. Figures such as Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad became a defining characteristic of pre-Civil War America, estimating that anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 slaves successfully escaped to freedom. Yay. But with Western expansion continuing, the fragile balance of pro-slave and anti-slave states, much of the many tensions between the North and the South accelerated. The Missouri Compromise, which allowed Maine admittance as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and all Western lands south of Missouri, southern line to be free, the balance was maintained. But in 1854, after the Mexican War and more land was added to the American territories, the KansasNebraska Act reopened the question of slavery in the new lands. And the new state of Kansas, which was admitted into the Union and allowed to choose whether it wanted to be a slave state. So people in that state had the option. Created both a bloodbath of civil unrest, known as Bleeding Kansas. Just 6 years later, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, 7 states, as we know, seceded from the United States of America, with 4 more to come, and named themselves the Confederate States of America. Does anybody remember which was the very first state to secede? Kind of started the whole entire Civil War. It was South Carolina. And then the others followed, like one after the other. While Lincoln's abolitionist personal views were well known, it was with the idea of reuniting the American Union that caused him to move to war. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln read an initial Emancipation Proclamation that named slaves within any state or designated part of a state in rebellion shall be thenceforward and forever free. With that and around 3 million newly freed Black slaves in the Southern rebellion states, the Emancipation Proclamation took the economic advantage out from under the Southern economy, and the war ended in 1865, with a new country emerging from the bloodiest battle in American history. And I don't know if you're all aware of this, but prior to Lincoln issuing the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, the North was losing the war. And Lincoln was so afraid that with that status, Britain would get involved in our war with the Confederate States, and it would have absolutely changed history. So the turning point really was with the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think quite often what our world would be like, what our country would be like if the Confederates actually had won the war. It would be a very, very different life than we know today. Though abolished in 1865, the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery, did not spell out an easy assimilation into American society for the recently freed Blacks. And the equal protection and right to vote that followed would not make their progress any easier either. In the wake of Black freedom, many racist organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan and the rise of white supremacy, continues to plague American society as we know even today. We hear about it every single day in the news, right? And it's been more than a century since the Civil War ended. The Civil Rights Movement during the mid-20th century would be the next great gain for American Blacks towards freedom in America. So I want to tell you a little bit about what the living conditions were like for slaves on the plantations. But before I delve into that, I do want to mention that the Southerners who lost the Civil War were so bitter and so angry about their lifestyle being really ripped out from under them. They really took it out on the freed slaves, and they went out of their way to make their lives just as hard, if not harder, than it was while they were enslaved. Yeah, it was not the freedom that they expected to have, but they were legally free. Slave living conditions were often terrible. For example, slave homes were quite small and were generally one-room shacks that were made out of wooden logs or planks. Due to their poor construction, the slave homes often struggled to properly heat inside, and the slaves sometimes suffered on very cold nights. Also, according to Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War, they reeked in the summer and they bred so many germs that these slaves were constantly contracting malaria and tuberculosis and a just myriad of health conditions from the living conditions that they were provided with. Today, our understanding of the life of slaves in the United States comes from several famous firsthand accounts. Likely, the most famous of these comes from Frederick Douglass. Born as a slave in 1818 in Maryland, and that's another thing I didn't know. I lived in Maryland for 4 years. I didn't even realize that it was considered a southern state, and it was a slave state. Yes. You don't really think of Maryland being a southern state, and especially not a slave state, but it was. You just don't talk about it that much.
No.
And yeah. Douglass is one of the few people in history to know life on both sides of the coin, per se. After his escape, Douglass wrote the narrative of life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, which was written in 1845 and gave people insight into what life as a slave was really like. So this information that I am sharing with you are true accounts from people who actually lived the life. This, along with 2 other autobiographies written by Douglass, is regarded as the best examples of slave narrative tradition in history. Because of these accomplishments, Frederick Douglass is often considered to be the single most important Black American leader of the 19th century. Douglass wrote the following about his time as a slave on a plantation. And another little bit of trivia for you. Frederick Douglass was the product of a slave mother and a plantation owner master. So he was actually biracial. Here's what he says. I suffered from much hunger, but much more from cold. In hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked, no shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse toe linen shirt reaching only to my knees. I had no bed. I must have perished with cold, but the coldest nights, I used to steal a bag which was used for carrying corn to the mill. I would crawl into this bag and there sleep on the cold, damp clay floor with my head in and my feet out. My feet have been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes. He's talking about his feet. Daily life for slaves in the United States consisted of several main topics, including their working conditions, clothing, food, and education. In terms of daily life, slaves in the United States faced difficult and tiring work conditions. At the time, most slaves in the United States worked in agricultural work on these plantations. In fact, most of their time was spent working harvesting crops such as cotton, rice, indigo, and tobacco. And this work was extremely labor intensive, especially prior to the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. As such, the slaves worked long and tiring shifts to work as many as 16 hours a day in hot and humid weather. At the same time, slaves also struggled due to the different forms of punishment and abuse that they were forced to endure on these plantations. The regular food and diet of slaves varied between the different plantations, but they were never, but there were several main similarities throughout the time frame of slavery in the United States. Excuse me. For example, historians have noticed that the most common diet of slaves in the southern states consisted of pork, rice, and corn. While this diet kept the slaves well fed, it denied them of a variety of nutrients. As such, slaves rarely differed from nutrient deficiencies, along with diseases that made them more prone to different types of illnesses. Frederick Douglass commented about the food he received as a slave in the following passage from his famous book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And he says in his narrative, our food was coarse corn meal boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs. And like so many pigs, they would come and devour the mush. Can you even imagine? Yet another aspect of slave daily life was their education, or actually lack thereof. In general, most slave owners did not educate their slaves at all. They did this for a variety of reasons. First of all, African slaves were looked at, and we talked about this before, as being inferior to whites. Thus, many slave owners believed that the slaves were incapable of learning. They thought of them as children. Second, slave owners were concerned about the potential for slave rebellion and did not want to help educate slaves. As a result of their poor education, almost all slaves in the United States were unable to read. The few slaves that did learn did so by teaching themselves or were taught by more lenient slave owners. The final aspect of slave daily life was the enforcement of slave codes. Slave codes were the laws that set out rules for slaves in the United States. The first area to establish a slave code was our famous state of South Carolina, which adopted earlier British policies in 1712. Other regions of the United States followed South Carolina's lead. In general, the slave codes of the time limited the actions that a slave could take. For example, one such rule was that slaves were not allowed to leave the slave owner's property unless they were joined by a white person. The slave codes also had harsh punishments for slaves who tried to escape. This included whippings, brandings with branding irons, and even the death penalty. They were regularly hung. Slaves were also banned from owning weapons and punished if they were found to have stolen items. In all, the slave codes attempted to control the daily life and activities of slaves in the United States. And it's quite apparent that they were doing this purposely, through intimidation to create constant fear to keep them under control. And the other thing I want to mention here, based on what I've read so far, I am not seeing one single ounce of evidence where any slave developed any skills that may have benefited them, like the state of Florida is trying to push now into law. I don't get that at all. It wasn't their choice. And the other reason why I don't buy into that is because if South Carolina and all the Confederate States had their way, they never would have freed their slaves. They never would have ended slavery. So it's such a contradiction to me that they were being taught and benefiting from skills that they learned to go on with a free life, because there was no plan to ever free them from the life of slavery. The abuse that African slaves experienced in the United States is well documented. For instance, slaves were regularly subjected to beatings, whippings, and other forms of torture, as I already mentioned. Much of this abuse was carried out by the overseers of the plantations. In fact, abuse towards slaves was regular occurrence and was used by slave owners and overseeing as a way of maintaining order on the plantation. Furthermore, slaves were also branded by their slave owners, which displayed the idea that slaves were physical property that could be owned. Well, that's exactly what it represented, and they did own them. They bought and sold them like cattle. While slaves usually suffered from poor medical attention, some historians have argued that slaves in the United States were treated better than slaves in other parts of the New World. For instance, owning slaves was a major financial investment, and most slave owners likely wanted to protect their investment by medically treating any hurt or injured slaves. For example, some evidence suggests that slaves in the United States lived an average lifespan of only about 36 years. That was according to the census report of 1850. This is significant because slaves in other parts of the New World lived substantially shorter lives than 36 years old. For instance, slaves in Brazil typically only lived to be about 23 years old on average, due to even worse abuse. Ultimately, the improved health and medical treatment of slaves in the United States caused the slaves' population to grow substantially throughout the 19th century. And by the time of 1860, which was right before the Civil War started, there were as many as 4 million slaves in the country. With all of this said, slaves in the United States still experience terrible abuses. Another element of abuse that slaves suffered through in the United States was the sexual abuse of slave women. And Frederick Douglass was a product of that example. At the time, slave women were legally allowed to be sexually abused and raped by their slave owners. As such, many instances of abuse occurred during the years of the antebellum period, which stretched from the late 1700s until the events of the Civil War starting in 1861. This treatment of slave women was terrible for their mental and physical health. Some historians have argued that it destroyed the family structure of slave communities at that time. And although not a form of physical abuse, according to the whites, the slave owners, slaves also suffered from psychological terror. Keeping slaves afraid was a common tactic among slave owners and overseers in a way of maintaining order, as we said. In fact, slave rebellions were known to occur, and slave owners used fear as a means of preventing a slave uprising. The slave owners and overseers did this in a few ways. First, slaves were in constant terror from facing physical abuse and punishment. As stated above, slave punishment was common in the U.S., especially during the antebellum period from the 1700s until the 1860s. Second, slaves were psychologically abused when their children and family members were sold. Slaves were sold an average of 1 to 2 times during their tenure on any of their plantations. And it was very common for the partners or wives. It wasn't a legal marriage, but they still called them husbands and wives, and their children to be sold right out from under them. In fact, some states became very profitable from producing and selling slaves. For example, this was very true in Virginia, which produced more slaves than it needed and made profit by selling them to other slave-owning states. And that's what I have for you today in terms of what a picture, a glimpse of what life was like for the slaves pre-Civil War and pre the Emancipation Proclamation. And a lot of those slaves joined the Union Army to help continue the fight for their freedom. To me, this information is just so chilling and so mind-boggling. But Lillian and Betsy are going to press fast forward and bring you up to date with human slavery as it exists today. And to be honest with you, what we have learned is it's not much different from what I just described to you pre-Civil War days, when people actually owned other people. So Lillian, take it away.
Well, they actually still own it, but the United States cannot put themselves forward as the land of the free and the home of the brave. Because after the research I did today, what the United States really stands for is the home of how much money I can make out of this. And don't tell me I cannot continue in doing this, because it really is a good economic for our country. and a lot of it does. They describe the United States as a hub, but I describe the United States as a portal, the way people find portals and ghosts and letting up demons. Because what they do is that so much transactions of these children and women and men get passed through the United States. And the government, both federal, state, and local governments, are all aware of it. And they turn a blind eye because it is a multi-billion-dollar economy. So what did I find out? Not only do they turn a blind eye, but the prosecutors don't do anything at all. One of the first cases they brought up was Jeffrey Epstein, who apparently had a large network of human trafficking all over the world. And this gentleman, not only was not punished severely, he received 13 months in jail. And then he was allowed the privilege of leaving jail to go out to work 6 days a week without anybody, without one of those collars on his legs to track him, which is just incredible, considering the media coverage this gentleman got for slave trafficking, but nothing was done. And they say that the estimates for the U.S. is between 240,000 to 325,000 people a day are trafficked. And the question they ask is, why doesn't anybody pay attention? And yet when the movie The Sound of Freedom came out, it misrepresented some information, and it was so extreme that even in California, where they had a bill that came up to increase punishment for these types of trafficking of children, the bill never got off the ground. They dismissed it. Even though everybody was watching the movie and saying, oh, that's terrible. How can we let this happen? How can our society prevent it? And yet in California, they had an opportunity to prevent it, and they couldn't get enough votes. Nobody wanted to stop the flow of money coming in, because the companies that are funding this are the very companies which are saying, oh, this is so terrible. We really need to do something about this. This is just awful. There's a story that the Orlando newspaper put out about a lady. They called her Doreen. And the name of a hurricane, Doreen, swept through her end of Florida and destroyed her home. And she was a single mom, and she had 2 kids, and they didn't have any place to live. So rather than take them into a shelter with her, she gave them to her husband's family to raise, and she went into a shelter. Story goes, one day a man approached her and promised her a good paying job, a good place to live, and insurance. And because she was desperate, she took his request seriously and said, yes, I'll go with you. What happened was 10, 15 miles away from where she started, she was put into a dilapidated house with 13 other people, and she was forced to work for under the minimum wage, which at that time was $7, in a hotel as a chambermaid, and also at a large theme park. Well, the only large theme parks down there is Walt Disney. and one that's put up by some of the studios. But nobody questioned it because these were agencies that were representing the traffickers. And the only reason why she escaped was that the police raided the joint. And that's the only reason why she escaped, and told her story to a reporter from the Orlando newspaper. That's pretty nasty. As I said before, trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar business. And they put it down to certain problems. The border from down south, so it's mostly Mexicans that come up, and it's the Mexicans, wealthy Mexicans, and the cartels that are in charge of the trafficking. Social media. They also have access to schools and colleges, the homeless, and kids running away from home. So let's still take a closer look. When they went in to do some research on this, and this is from the Daily Signal, and it's a newspaper article, they talked about 3 kids. One was 11 years old, and her own parents sold her for drugs. There was a 14-year-old. She met an older man. He promised her a better job, a good family to take care of. Didn't work out either. And then there was another person, a young man who was 15, and he was in the foster care system, and he was mistreated and abused. So he went out and lived on the streets, and he was approached while he lived on the streets, and he was trafficked and sold. So they say that on an average, children by the age of 14 enters into the United States involved in the sex trade. And since they're already abused, they're told they can make more money if they sell their bodies, and it won't be a big deal because they've already been abused. So this damage is already done. And for a lot of these kids who feel that there's nobody out there who wants to help them, there's no white knight coming along to rescue them, why not? What do they have to lose? And what they don't understand is they're kids, and that it can be a lot harsher. Most of the time, these kids are put into slave conditions, where at night their feet are enclosed in metal rings and they're bolted by chains to either the walls, or they'll loop through a hole that's in the wall and the chain is looped that way, and they can't go anywhere. And they're usually given bread and, yes, a little bit of water, and for their sanitary needs are given a bucket. And that's it, folks. Imagine your child being treated that way. I bet you can't. I bet that's the kind of story you tell your children around a campfire, maybe as something to scare them. Or maybe tell your child, well, it may be bad here, but it's a lot worse out in the streets. Listen to this. A lot of the kids who wind up in trafficking are sold by their own parents, by relatives, even by friends, whether it's for drugs, whether it's because they need some cigarette money, or sometimes it's alcohol. Then they have a scheme called rent a child, where a predator will take a child and they'll rent him out for sex. They expect that child to perform 6 or 7 times at the rate of $99. Sometimes it's more, because the people who are renting these children want to make a lot of money. These children never see the money that their pimp or their perpetrator is paid for their services. Some kids are forced to have sex 20 times a day, 6 days a week. Sound like the slavery that Lisa Skinner was talking about? Because that's exactly what it is. Most of the time, these sex acts are done in hotels, motels, or they're found on websites, or they're found in truck stops, and also in adult bookstores. A lot of the trade comes from Mexico and the Philippines, and it's about 500,000 people, children, who are brought and sold across the border, Mexico and the Philippines. So the next time you go see the Philippines, because it's on your bucket list, and you see those little 9, 10, and 11-year-old girls turning tricks, that's because they're part of the traffic trade, and their parents sold the girls off because they needed the money for groceries. So the next time your husband tells you he's going out with a night with the boys and you're overseas in the Philippines, remember your husband or boyfriend might be contributing to the sex trade, because over there, it's not considered rape to have sex with a 9-year-old child. It's considered business as usual. These predators also use websites to pick up their prey. And there's a certain type of child that they look for on these websites. And it's not so much that these girls and some of the boys are exposing their bodies. It's that they go to these websites knowing they're going to find kids from broken homes, or maybe from single parent homes where the kid has been abused, or verbally or emotionally abused, and they have a sense about a child, whether or not they're so down on themselves that they are defenseless, and they look for these clues to help them say, "Hi, I'm about your age. Do you want a friend? I know exactly what you're going through." They also use psychology to get these kids to feel like there was somebody who understands what their trouble is, what their problem is, and they sympathize with them. And they build on that sympathy, giving them their virtual shoulder to cry on. And the next step is to make an appointment and have them meet somewhere. So listen to your parents when they tell you, we really rather not have you put that picture out on yourself in your 2-piece bathing suit, because that's exactly what the predators are looking for. They also, about 83% are American kids who are snared on these websites. Again, America, 83%. That's not too far off from 100%, folks. Now, there are 4 main factors. We've already went over some of them. The first is the southern border with the immigration. You don't hear the Republicans talk about that, do you? About all that money that's walking across the borderline so they can get into the United States. More than half the kids coming over with the immigration down south are unchaperoned children. When Biden released over 400 kids, he released them to families who already had other children to take care of. So a lot of these kids, when they're released to so-called foster families, there are too many kids for these parents to make sure they're safe and taken care of. And these kids leave to try to get a better life for themselves. They never make it because they're caught by the predators that are out there I guess you could call them the great white sharks of our society, who are hungry, not for blood, but for money and for power. And then you have the pornography and the pedophiles. And what they do is entice these kids to make videos of them. And then the videos are displayed all over the world on the pornography sites. One of the sites had, it's called Pod Hub, and they got shamed. So overnight, they took down more than half of all their videos. And they, MasterCard, Visa, and Discover stopped doing business with these people. But they needed to be shamed first publicly over social media before the giants of the credit card companies decided that they weren't going to accept charges anymore on this site for underage sex. In case you're wondering how far this corruption has gone, we're talking about the three major credit card companies of the United States. Discover, which started out with Sears and Roebuck's company. Visa, everywhere you want to be, I bet. And Visa. Think about that too. Anybody can use a credit card for anything. These kids are bought and sold on the open market. Gee, that sounds just like slavery, what Lisa Skinner defined as slavery, doesn't it? And we're not even at a war. I guess we are, but nobody looks at it as a war. You could say it's a war for good versus evil, or slavery versus non-slavery, only talking about sex and flesh, which are always big winners. Yes? I went and looked up the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. And they have a fact sheet for schools that I wanted to include because I think it's important. And the first thing they do is define what human trafficking is. And they say that human trafficking is a serious federal crime with penalties up to imprisonment for life. And that federal law defines severe forms of trafficking in persons as A, sex trafficking, and which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not become 18 years of age. It's also considered the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for labor or services through the use of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. And of course, the question is, what part of that sentence didn't you understand? That's the same definition that Lisa Skinner gave for slavery with the African Americans here in the United States. Then they asked, what is the extent of human trafficking in the United States? And they go on to say an unknown number of U.S. citizens and legal residents are trafficked within the country for sexual servitude and forced labor. Contrary to a common assumption, human trafficking is not just a problem in other countries. Cases of human trafficking have been reported in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and the U.S. territories. Victims of human trafficking can be children or adult, U.S. citizens or foreign nationals, male or female, and I suspect also the transgender. So you can find examples of child trafficking, commercial sex, stripping, pornography, forced begging. And one of the best ways to help combat human trafficking is to raise awareness and learn more about how to identify victims. And you can go over to the website, and they also gives you additional resources that you can go to that we will list for you in the blog in case you want to find out more about human trafficking. And I think that you need to go and take a look of what's offered, because according to them, a lot of the human trafficking victims are taken straight from school. All those kids that disappear, that are nabbed as they leave elementary school, those are the kids who are concerned. Betsy, any thoughts?
Wow. Thank you, Lillian and Lisa. That's a lot of information that just sends chills down my spine. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. As I was listening, and I did watch 2 documentaries last night about breeding with the slaves, the women, and how they made men go impregnate as many women as possible, and how they wanted these women to have as many children as possible. And as Lisa discussed about the diseases that were going on, they had, complications. These children were sold as young as 2 years old. This is such a sad, heartbreaking part of American history that we do need to discuss. I was never heard of breeding farms, ever. I just found out last night, and I'm 65 years old. You learn every day. I was heartbroken. And they wanted more slaves. And as Lisa was talking about the cotton gin, they needed more slaves to work the cotton, to pick at the cotton. And the slaves were not fed very well. And as Lisa was discussing about the food, the lack thereof, and the sanitary conditions, I couldn't help but think about the Holocaust conditions. How similar were they? And even though some of the slaves might have been the overseers, the drivers, as they called them, they also paid a penalty when their time was done with that job. Just like in the Holocaust, you had the other Jews putting other Jews in the oven, and they were in charge, but they ended up dying also. I was thinking of someone. I was on someone's show who interviewed me, and he told me that he rescued somebody. This was out in California, from the sex trade. And he didn't want to be publicly really known. So he went undercover, and I was supposed to interview him like 2 months later. This was 3 years ago. He disappeared. His business number disconnected. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he died or if he went in witness protection. Excuse me. He was supposed to testify in court. Maybe he didn't make it to court. Do you know what I mean? And I don't want to get Pastoral Talk Radio into trouble or get banned from YouTube, so I won't use the name. There's a social platform, folks. They allow women to advertise themselves. And yet they put people on restriction for talking about Alzheimer's, or maybe having a different view about a vaccine or any other political thing. So you wonder, is certain social media people involved in the sex trade? Why do they allow this? Why do they allow women to advertise themselves? Now, I personally have never been approached, but I do get every day, I don't know how they've gotten my email address, notifications, young girls for sex. every day. These are probably young women. And I think to myself, how do they get my email? And how do they get these girls? And they are tattooed, as I saw in The Sound of Freedom. They get tattooed, they get marked, you were ownership. They tattooed or branded people during the slavery time. The way the slaves were treated were really, to me, just like Jews and other people were treated during the Holocaust. And again, it's a sad commentary. I worked in a facility where I was the minority, and I learned a lot, really, about the African American culture. And someone that I worked with told me, she said, Betsy, we're not used to being an authority because we were always, slaves. We weren't used to being. So they weren't trained to be an authority. And so, this was kind of new for them. Also, a lot of the foods that are common in the African American culture today were because of the slave days, like chitlins and certain other foods, because they hardly had any food. And I still can't figure out or wrap my brain around this. You expect people to work hard, overwork them on little substance of food, and then you kill them because they couldn't perform the work because you starved them. Makes no sense to me at all. This is such man's inhumanity to man. It's like almost the Twilight Zone, where you can't believe that this actually happened, but it did, and it's still going on, folks. That's the heartbreaking thing, as Lillian talked about. Slavery's still going on, stronger than ever before. Excuse me. Selling children. And I have watched movies where children were sold for groceries. Parents couldn't afford to raise their children, so they sold them. They pimped them out. I often wondered when I was younger, where do they get these children from to do these pornography and the sex trade? Well, then I, found out. But, you didn't hear about this growing up in the 60s and 70s. And Lillian is 100% right in her information about the websites. There's the dark web. Yes, technology is wonderful, but you have the dark web. And let me tell you, they are out there. That's why I beg and plead with the audience. Watch what your children are doing. Be aware what they're doing. Make sure they're not strutting their bodies out for all the world to see. As I said last week, all they have to do is Google your name and they get your address. There's ways of finding out people's address. And that is really terrifying. So when you post and there's nothing wrong with posting pictures of your kids, but folks, be careful and be aware. Lillian talked about last week. I talked about it last week. You cannot be oblivious on your phone when your children are out in public. You just can't. This is a day and age where you have to be aware. Leave the phone for later. You have to be aware of what is going on around you. When I worked at the preschool, and I worked at predominantly Indian children, that's the population in my area, parents told me about the slave trade in India. And they actually did poke out children's eyes and make them beg, or they kidnap them and use them as sex trade. These parents moved to America so that their children would not be sold. They were afraid of that. And when they go visit India, they told me their concerns. They don't let their children out of their sight because they're afraid of their children getting kidnapped. This is worldwide, folks. And I said last week, and I'll say it again, in Thailand, these rich people, very wealthy people, go to these countries such as Thailand to have sex with underage children. This it's mind-boggling to me. I'm not a psychiatrist of why a grown person would want to have sex with a child, but they had these children and they could sell them over and over and over again. It's really heartbreaking. Really, I feel like I'm crying right now from the information Lillian gave because it just touches me so deeply. It doesn't take long, folks, for someone to kidnap your child. Don't leave your child in a car. Don't leave your child unattended. Teach your children about stranger danger. Lillian talked about that last week. I taught that in preschool, stranger danger, not going with somebody, yelling, I don't know you when they pick child up. This kids are very cute, and I miss working with them. One boy said, Miss Betsy, can I karate chop them in the throat? I said, yes. That's when you can karate chop them in the throat. Yes, you can. You teach about stranger danger, even your neighbor. You have to tell your children, ask me about going next door. In New Jersey, there's Megan's Law was passed. Megan was a little girl who was raped and murdered by her neighbor who was a sexual predator, and nobody in the neighborhood knew. How did he lure this little girl? By telling her he had a puppy. Now, that may not have anything to do with the sex trade, but this is how they lure your children. So even I told my kids, even if you go to a neighbor's house, you have to ask your parent, your nanny, who's ever watching, permission. Let them know. We grew up, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I was told about certain things about stranger danger. Never did I think about being sold. Never crossed my mind. And this is happening more and more. And not just children, teenagers, but even, women in their 20s and 30s. And I had to say this, for you women out there, be alert of what you are doing. Walk into your car. I just saw on, I think it was Instagram, this woman who was experiencing law enforcement. She said, do not walk by a van. Do not walk by cars. If you see anything suspicious, do not go near there. Be alert. I know a lot of people jog, a lot of people walk with their earbuds. I would not recommend that. You want to hear what's going on around you. Women with long hair and a ponytail, they could grab your hair. I did see that on the safety video. The predators look for people who are not aware, especially women. If you see you have a flat tire and there's a suspicious man, go into a store. You have AAA, call them, call towing service. If you see anybody suspicious, do not go near them. Follow your instinct. You have an instinct for a purpose. And if it's saying the area is not safe, trust it. Go back into the store. I've done that many times. And I was with Josh, and I have gone back into a store if I didn't like who was coming out with me. I learned to follow my instincts. And you have to be aware. Have your keys ready. Don't be on the phone. Have your keys ready and look around your car. Look at your environment. If you see someone in the car, look at them. Let them know you see them, because it doesn't take long for someone to grab you and throw you in the trunk. And if I may, Lillian, I want to go over like a little safety. If you find yourself thrown in a trunk of a car, punch out a light, rip wires if you can. If someone throws you in the front of the car, cause an accident, step on their feet, step on the brakes, step on the gas, do something. If they're not moving too fast, see if you can get out of the car. You do not want to go from point A to point B. Me personally, I'd rather someone find my body right there. If they want your keys, throw the keys, your wallet, and you run the other way. Of course, you have to have your wits about you. But these are just things that I hope will keep you safe, because predators prey on the prey. And that was a great analogy you gave, Lillian, of the great white sharks, because these predators are sharks. They look for their prey. They look for weak people. They prey on weak people. And they use people's vulnerable abilities, their weak spot, against them. And that's what I have to say today, folks. Thanks again for listening. Please be vigilant. Please get involved. Please learn about what's going on in the world. Protect your children. They are our valuable resources. And you would feel quite guilty if you were oblivious and your child disappeared. Think about that. How would you feel? Thank you.
Our call to action is to please text us or send us an email saying, I listen to your program. I like it. I don't like it. I want to hear more. And jot down what you want to hear more. This program is for you, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, Lisa, Betsy, and I, we know how to do research on Google and find the information, and we love sharing it with you. But we also want to make a difference in your life, in your family's life, in your kids' life. Now, I know that when my son was around 9 years old and he was standing at the bus stop, some guy approached him in a group of the kids he was with a knife. He had been watching football all his short life, so he asked a friend to hold his book bag, and then he ran towards the guy and tackled him. And a neighbor saw him, and somebody in a car saw him tackle this big guy. The cop came out, and he couldn't stop praising Ben for taking immediate action. But I'm not saying every kids have their wits about them. I mean, my son, since I was a single parent, he had to grow up very quickly. And I made sure he knew how to defend himself and to do what he needed to do. And this was back in the 70s. Not everybody was being a hippie during the 70s. So he learned, and this was down in Houston, Texas, which was considered a wide open port city because all the big container ships would come in. So you can reach me at pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com, and you can text me at 484-364-1032. Betsy, where can they reach you to tell you?
Sloan, SLOAN, Betsy, BETSY 31 @gmail.com.
Great. And Lisa, where can I find you at?
Dementia Whisperer 1, the number 1, @gmail.com.
Thank you. And we have an update on Lisa Skinner's webinar that is being now going to be airing in October, because both Lisa and I have a lot of things on our plate at the moment, and September is coming too soon. So we will be sending out announcements within the next week to let you know about the upcoming seminar about caregiving and working with your loved one who has Alzheimer's. You have anything to add to that, Lisa?
No, I want to thank everybody for taking their valuable time and listening to this. I'll tell you, kind of along the same lines as Betsy, and I'm sure you too, Lillian, my head is absolutely spinning right now, and I'm blown away at all the information and the things I learned. I feel like I've been living my life with my head in the sand, because a lot of this information I wasn't aware of. And I don't live on, an isolated island. So it's really scary to think that these things are so prevalent today, but I don't think there's any doubt, especially now, after learning what I've learned today, that this is the real world. And we really, as Betsy said, we have to stay alert and pay attention to everything around us and follow our instincts. I've always relied on my instincts, and so far, so good. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to seeing you back here next week for another new episode of Lest We Forget - Historical.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.